All right. Well, welcome to Ask the Experts, Solitary Confinement. This is a webinar hosted by the Student Alliance for Prison Reform. I'm Daniel Teehan. I'll be moderating. I'm from Princeton's Students for Prison Education and Reform. And I'm lucky enough to be here with five Mualimm-ak, Jean Casella, and Johnny Perez. You guys want to start off by introducing yourselves? You all belong to more organizations than I could list.
Sure. So I'm Johnny Perez. I am the Safe Reentry Advocate at the Urban Justice Center's Mental Health Project. I'm also a member of the Jails Action Coalition and the Campaign for Alternatives Isolated Confinement. I also have direct involvement with solitary confinement, having served 3 years total out of a 13-year sentence.
Hi, I'm Jean Casella, and I'm from Solitary Watch. We're a watchdog website that tracks and disseminates information about solitary confinement, which is, we believe, is the greatest domestic human rights crisis that most people have never heard of.
And my name is Mualimm-ak. I am the founder of the Incarcerated Nation Corporation, which is a collective of those previously incarcerated working to support those incarceration and suffering from the disenfranchisement of mass incarceration itself. Also a part of Jack, as Johnny said, and I work with Solitary Watch. I too have spent some time incarcerated, and out of that, over 5 years in isolated confinement.
Well, we're glad to have all of you here, and we'll delve into all the work that you're doing. But I guess to start with, since we're here to talk about solitary confinement, it might be good to just get a quick rundown on solitary, its history, what it looks like today, what exactly we're talking about when we use this term solitary confinement. So, Jean, do you want to start by giving us a quick history of solitary in the U.S.?
Yeah, solitary confinement is actually an American invention. It was invented in the late 18th century, the late 1700s, as other forms of punishment at that time, like capital punishment, whippings, floggings, stocks, and things like that. The origin of the word penitentiary comes from Eastern State Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, which was the first all-solitary prison, with the idea that if people were locked away alone, they would contemplate their sins and become penitent. That's the origin of the word penitentiary. But something quite different happened, of course. Instead, people went mad, committed suicide, were unable to re-enter society as functioning human beings. So solitary took a break in American society after a Supreme Court decision punishment. But it was revived with the growth of mass incarceration in the 1980s. And suddenly we have supermax prisons in almost every state, and we have 80,000 people on any given day in America who are in their cells 22 to 24 hours a day.
Thanks for providing some of that context. So maybe do you want to talk a little bit about what life looks like for those 80,000 people in any given day? It's quite different from what it started with in Eastern State Penitentiary. So some of the different reasons it's used and what conditions are like today.
Yes, thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you so much, Jean, for that accurate description. Yeah, it's sad to say that we confine this many people in a small space, which is literally the space of a small elevator or the smallest size of your bathroom, 6x9 or a 7x9 cell. There's usually arbitrary multiple variations or arbitrary reasons why people are placed inside of isolation. One of them are rule infractions. So it's kind of two different reasons that can end you into this confinement. One, if you fall into a category, which is somewhat as listed, then you can actually be placed inside isolation under those categories. Now, those categories never are solitary confinement. It is always whether the administration feels that you're a threat because of maybe your political history or your connections or your outside involvement, Then there's also isolation in the form of protective custody, involuntary protective custody, control units. There's a huge slew of variations. But solitary confinement is usually a punitive segregation method in which people receive disciplinary infractions for rule violations. So one of the greatest misconceptions is that people are placed inside of isolation because of their criminal charges or why they were placed inside incarceration. But it's actually the rules that you break inside. So something as simple as forgetting to pick up your fork in a mess hall, or literally just talking back to an officer. Maybe having over the allotted amount of items that you're allowed to have, and these type of rule infractions will end you in solitary. I say that because I myself was placed inside of isolation for frivolous charges, numerous amounts of ticket violations, for conditions that really apply to anyone. So having too many postage stamps, having pencils if they're written up as weapons, were some of the reasons why I was placed in isolation and then remained there. 6x9 cell, so we're talking about a very, very secluded area. There's barely enough room to stretch out your arms without touching both walls. Most people in New York State are placed within double cells, which is a little bit bigger, and they have a shower unit placed in there and a small door that extends out. But this confinement, while you're isolated away from society, away from any type of human contact, and then they open the door and throw someone else in there. It's called double celling process. You end up, without isolation or any type of human contact, reverting back into yourself. So if you're alone, you sometimes end up talking to yourself, and it's not too hard to memorize your environment locked in this room, so your brain, if it doesn't have any stimulation, will deteriorate.
Yeah. So, Johnny, do you have anything to add as far as that kind of the experience of solitary goes?
Yeah, I think it's important to know, especially in New York, that any infraction you catch while in the box only leads to more box time, even if that ticket wouldn't normally send you to the box in the first place. Now, we have seen some strides, as far as Rikers Island, but to my understanding, in the state is still, some of the same, I guess, injustices is still going on. So imagine being in a place so quiet that you can hear your heartbeat, or sometimes it gets so loud that you can barely hear your own voice from people screaming on the gate, banging on the gate. You're completely dependent on another person for your livelihood. So you're reduced to this like infantile stage where you have to ask the officer for soap, toothbrush, toothpaste. Even sometimes you go without human contact for so long that you just you yearn for conversation and you want to talk to anybody, including the officer, but the officer doesn't have time or doesn't want to talk to you because maybe of the way that he's been trained, or maybe he just doesn't like you, or maybe he's just not in that mood today. He just wants to do his 8 and skate, as they say. It's not uncommon to find somebody who goes to the box and see, let's say he's there for, I don't know, 90 days for dirty urine. He ends up with years at a time because of all the other infractions he received while he was there. And these infractions can range from not giving back the food tray to maybe having too many blankets, or maybe cutting up his blanket and putting it on a shower. Use it as a shower sheet, excuse me, as a shower curtain, which you're not allowed to have shower curtains, even though in some boxes there's a shower right inside the cell. And the double cell that Five was talking about, people might hear that and say, oh, well, that's not too bad. At least you have somebody to talk to. But the problem with that is that you don't really know exactly what it is you've been encountering. And that situation can actually be more dangerous. I mean, when you go into a cell and there's a person that's already been there for, I don't know, 3-4 years, and then all of a sudden they just put you in there, or maybe he's on the bottom bunk and they're forcing him now to go on the top bunk, you're already going into a hostile environment. And sometimes, even officers create that hostile environment where they pit people together and then bet on them to fight and see who's going to win. Or they might create tension by giving one trade to 2 people and then let them fight it out. So, the dehumanization, the stress that comes with it, the increased anger, aggression, all of that can just lead to long-term psychological consequences, including more box time when you're there.
Yeah. So the fact that it could range from one person to 2 person, from a period of a couple of days to decades, that it varies in jurisdictions for how it's applied. Does that kind of variance in what solitary confinement actually is, the kind of difficulty in pinning it down, does that make it harder to advocate uniformly against this term solitary confinement, Gene, you probably have some experience in writing about it. I mean, I know we've gotten pushback when we try to say solitary confinement. In New Jersey, they say, no, no, we're double bunking. That's not solitary. But,
Right.
we're really talking about the same phenomenon, right?
Yes, absolutely. And as Five said, there are as many euphemisms for solitary confinement as you can imagine. We have administrative segregation, punitive segregation, disciplinary segregation, special housing units, special management units, intensive management units, and on and on and on. Anything except solitary confinement. Recently, the UN, in its report on international human rights, found fault with the United States through its use of solitary confinement, its extensive use of prolonged solitary confinement. And the response of the U.S. State Department was, we don't have solitary confinement in the United States. In fact, the United States is the only country in the developed world that makes extensive use of solitary confinement. I think as far as making it more difficult to resist and respond to solitary, I think that it makes it more difficult to have a national movement. But on the other hand, I think all three of us probably know 3/4 of the people around the country who are working on this issue. It's a really close-knit group, and we really exchange a lot of information and encouragement about our state-level campaigns. But of course, we don't have one prison system in this country. We have 51 prison systems, 50 states and a federal system. So that means we have to fight this issue on all fronts.
And even more when you incorporate immigration detention and military detention.
Absolutely.
I'm wondering, thinking about immigrant detention, if you guys can talk a little bit about the demographics of people who are put in solitary, because I know it's used as a punitive technique, but also as a targeting technique, and a lot of the justification for putting youth in solitary is the protective custody that's used, also not just for youth, but for other populations. So maybe Five or Johnny, can you talk about the demographics of people in solitary?
Yes, in New York State, when I was incarcerated, especially inside of isolation, it would seem like it was a seamless transfer period right into ICE detention facility in Orleans. And that is a process for deportation, and literally ICE controls that facility.
ICE
so
being
people
immigration control and enforcement.
Yes. So when people are placed on hold to be waiting to be deported, if you have that detention number or that detention letter on your paperwork, you're going to be sent to another solitary unit. And even in Jersey and Newark, people who are waiting immigration detention are held in isolation within close confines quarters. And the same thing, like I said, goes for New York State. And in America itself, 34,000 is the quota I believe America has to hold detained prisoners and sell them literally to private prisons around the world. But the demographics of everyone in isolation, and especially in New York State and in other states as well, is everyone, because no one is excluded from this punishment paradigm. No one is excluded from this category. So when you have solitary units, you may have a person there because they're transgender, or a person there who is a woman and maybe even pregnant, or a child there who is 17, 18 years old. In New York, we have had, like Johnny said, made some changes to isolation, but all of that was by force. It was not the state itself saying that they were satisfied or even looking into different measures of alternate use. It was a lawsuit that forced New York State to create these conditions, right?
Yeah, Johnny, can you talk a little bit about the process in New York? I know you're all involved in through Jails Action Coalition and Campaign for Alternatives to Isolated Confinement in that movement, but can you talk a little more specifically about how those changes came about in New York?
Well, I think Five could talk a little bit better than I guess more toward than I can. But what I want to say is that so first, just recently they just excluded 16 and 17-year-olds from isolated confinement and placed them in what's being actually now being called TRU units. First they were called transitional repair units, but now we've managed to change the name and call them transitional restorative units, only because the word repair sounds like you're fixing a car and not a person.
Yeah.
And so we're still shaping that out, and we're looking at the directive to see exactly trying to incentivize people into good behavior versus trying to scare them to death with more box time. Um, there's also there's also been some changes concerning 18 to 21-year-olds and these enhanced supervised or enhanced supervision housing units. And the problem, I guess, some of the advocates see is that it's still solitary, just called by another name. And what I mean by that is that you're putting some of the most you're putting people who have a propensity for violence in the same space and asking them to get along. So this is just like a disaster waiting, an accident waiting to happen or a disaster waiting to happen, and then sooner or later somebody's gonna say, well, exactly, we needed. This is exactly why we need solitary. For the rest of the population, there's no more than 30 consecutive days in solitary and no more than 60 days within a 6-month period. Now, this is only concerning Rikers Island and not to New York State. Exactly how they came about, I think Five mentioned it before, as far as pressure. You have grassroots organization. It took a lot of people with direct involvement talking about their personal experience. It took a collective effort to kind of create that synergy and kind of force people to say, you know what, we need to take a look at this. This is not just people sitting inside of a cell. This is actual, like, this is torture. What's going on right in your backyard? And I think an example that Five likes to use, which I really appreciate, but it just speaks to the reality of the problem, is that, you when a kid misbehaves, you don't tell them, you don't lock them in a room for 3 years and feed them through a slot in the door, and that's exactly what was going on in Rikers Island. You had minors, sitting in isolation for days, weeks, months, even years at a time. And these are kids who are not even, their brain is not even fully developed yet. So you can only imagine the long-term psychological ramifications or consequences of being isolated for such a long period of time. And then the adults ask, well, why is he acting like that? Why is she acting like that? It's not that they're put in there because they're acting like that. They're acting like that because they're in there. So that's also important to take, to take a look at. And as a result of all of these conversations and people making noise, it forced the Board of Correction to take a look at it and made some changes. And although that we're not fully satisfied with all of the changes, in my personal opinion, I think that it is a step in the right direction.
I think it's really important to make the point as we begin to talk about the changes that are coming about, to just remember as we talk about it that actually very little has changed. The media loves to report on changes. Everything is the same as it always was is not a story. Something new is happening is a story. But most of the changes that have taken place have affected small minorities of the people in isolation, sometimes just the kids, sometimes people with only the most serious mental illness, and those who are lucky enough to be diagnosed properly with mental illness, then they may be able to be in some alternative form of custody. But most of the people who were in solitary 5 years ago are still in solitary today. Most of the same numbers of people.
Even in New York.
Even in New York, the numbers are fairly small in New York because it's kids and pregnant women, and it's perhaps 15 to 20% of the total in New York that have been removed as a result of both legislation and litigation.
Now, do you see that kind of even small change, do you see it as progress, or do you see it as counterproductive in that it lets people think we've solved that problem, now we can move on? Because, I think people see the headlines and they're like, okay, we fixed, there's only so much they can tolerate to think about solitary confinement at one time.
My concern is, I think it's wonderful. Everyone who gets out of solitary is another person who isn't suffering, tonight. But and often it is some of the most vulnerable groups that are being targeted with these legislative efforts and the litigation. What worries me is that we might get into a state of mind in which there are some people who are thought to be not deserving of solitary, and other people who are thought to belong there. And if we believe that this is torture, as I do, then nobody belongs there.
Yeah, so looking towards the larger goals of getting rid of solitary for everyone, or maybe we could talk about if that's what everyone's goal is. Maybe each one of you can talk a little bit about the approaches that you've taken in advocacy-wise so far, because they're all different. I know Gene, you do journalism, Five, and Johnny, different kinds of advocacy. So, Five, do you want to start with the work that you do at Incarcerated Nation?
Yes, of course. I just wanted to mention that in New York State, when we was on that topic of New York State, there is a lot of legislation out. So Assemblyman Danny O'Donnell has legislation, Assemblyman Rozek around pregnant women and around children. But it was also, like Johnny had said, it was a huge slew and a huge fight to get that small change. The New York Peoples versus Fisher case, of course, which made a small amount of change, like Gene was speaking about, but it's the right step. But there was also the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, who came in and did a huge testimony hearing around isolation in the youth. The Board of Corrections did its own investigation. Dr. Gilliam went in, did his own investigation. The Department of Investigation actually investigated itself. So it's a huge, plus the Department of Justice was on Rikers for 2 years. I mean, it was a huge slew of fighting, and Jails Action Coalition was the one who started the even conversation with the Board of Corrections about the Department of Corrections in Rikers Island and isolation. I just wanted to make that point because you hear all this stuff, like you said, in the news, and people think that it's a victory when it's actually just steps being made in the right progress.
Yeah.
Incarcerated Nation Corporation kind of started with our own individual stories. So we are all people previously incarcerated who, while going through reentry, seen the need for it, of course, so collectively we work toward that, but also that there's a large population of people that are released directly into society back from isolation. Literally like myself, 1 day solitary, $40 bus ticket, and next day you're back into society, thrown into the mix of finding out where to go and how to even provide for the small amount of services for yourself. So we try to network those services and bring them together under one format, which is this huge collective of projects, but also reentry services that is guided by individuals who have been through incarceration and who also experienced it. And Johnny, of course, does safe reentry advocacy for people coming from city jails, which is actually not a widely covered area. So people are just let out in one of the largest city jails on the planet, just literally given a Metro card, and that is it. There is no referral services to mental health services, and these are things that we fight for, but we also have to advocate and do the service ourselves.
Johnny, he started to answer the question for you, but do you want to?
Yeah.
Do you want to follow up?
So one of the main ways in which I advocate against solitary is basically bringing my personal experience into the conversation. You know, a lot of the people who are writing the law, and a lot of people in Albany, so on and so forth, they really don't know how the law actually acts or works in reality. So I put a face to the reality and kind of bring, the voice of somebody who has been personally affected by the issue, bring it closer home as possible. It's, from my experience, at least in the last year and a half of doing this work, is that people who have direct involvement are kind of excluded from these conversations. So I try to penetrate these circles and bring that voice and let people speak not only on my behalf, but speak on behalf of every man, woman, and child who is presently in isolation. As part of the Jails Action Coalition, which is a collection of advocates, people who are formerly incarcerated, some presently incarcerated. You have attorneys, you have social workers, you have just regular community members who come together and try to create this collective effort to try to better the conditions in prison, including isolated confinement. With testified hearings, and sometimes we even, just stand right in front of the Board of Correction hearings and just hold rallies and vigils, and we stand up in the middle of hearings, and we do silent protests. We make sure that the issue stays in the front line, because one of the things, and Gene spoke to this a lot, which it just jogged my memory, that people think if the media doesn't say anything, people forget about it as if it's not happening. Just because we're not speaking about it doesn't mean it's not happening. So, what we try to do is we try to constantly remind people that this is still happening. Not only is it happening, it's happening in your backyard. It's happening right now as we speak. Right now, what time is it? 9 o'clock. Right now, there's somebody in a cell right now trying to eat 4 slices of bread that he saved up, hoping that the officer doesn't catch him eating, because he'll get another ticket, which will equal more box time. And he's trying to figure out how he get in that situation. He hasn't even been sentenced yet. So this is happening right now, and this is one of the ways in which we try to advocate for that, is to keep the issue up front, and we keep it as human as possible. People think that we're exaggerating. These are not exaggerations. These are actual facts. I mean, just not too long ago, somebody, we talked about Bradley Ballard, basically Rikers Island, found dead a few days later. You have people cooking in their cells, So this is what's actually happening. It's not being sensationalized or nothing. But we try to just keep it, as visible as possible, and constantly remind people to where you can't ignore the elephant in the room any longer.
And one of the big things is, why are these people incarcerated? Why are these people having problems? Like Johnny mentioned, Bradley Ballard, which was one of the cases, but there was another case of Jerome Murtaugh, who was just arrested for being homeless, incarcerated because homelessness is illegal, had an over $2,000 bail, and baked to death in the cell. So just wanted to remind people that, when we speak about New York State and the great changes, like Johnny said, these people haven't been convicted of any crimes yet.
Yeah. And then, Gene, you do a very particular brand of journalism and activism around solitary. Can you talk a little bit?
Yeah, Solitary Watch was founded 5 years ago on the premise that we couldn't have change without a basic amount of knowledge and understanding of it, which at that time was completely invisible. There was really no reporting, very little movement around the issue. And myself and James Ridgway, my partner at Solitary Watch, began writing about this issue. I remember the very first story that we picked up was the story of a 17-year-old kid in Montana who had been in solitary confinement for about 15 months, and who had tried to commit suicide by biting through the veins in his arm because he was in a strip cell that had absolutely nothing there that he could use to kill himself. And I think, as Johnny said, it's important to have a certain kind of immediacy to these issues. One thing that we've done at Solitary Watch is we've published many, many, many stories by people in solitary out to us by letter, and tell us stories like the one I just told you, of the kind of anguish and suffering that goes on in that kind of isolation. And that's what I think that's what keeps us all going. I mean, we know that as we go to sleep tonight, there are 80,000 men, women, and children who are sleeping alone in their cells, and we can never do enough to try to end that practice.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, I mean, I think that one really powerful way of advocating is having those personal anecdotes and having the first-hand testimony. I mean, that's what really makes it real for people. But I'm sure as a journalist, you also look for ways to kind of objectively evaluate, solitary by the numbers and solitary, what it looks like. And I imagine that's a pretty hard task given what we've talked about, how much it varies. So, I mean, even that 80,000 number, where does that come from? How do you put solid facts on this kind of amorphous phenomenon?
That's a 15-year-old, partially incomplete number based on the self-reporting of prison wardens and state departments of corrections regarding how many people they keep in segregation. The government does not collect data on any kind of a regular basis on how many people are in this kind of situations. So what we have is actually very old, and it doesn't include jails or immigration detention. So the number is probably actually much higher. It's probably well over 100,000. In terms of our reporting, we kind of walk a fine line between journalism and activism. But with this issue, just telling the stories of people, but the facts surrounding solitary tell us that it not only is inhumane, but also ineffective. It's never been shown to be effective at reducing prison violence. I mean, that's what the numbers tell us in the few studies that have been done. And it actually increases recidivism. People who come directly out of solitary onto the streets are more likely to go back to prison more quickly than people who come out of the general population. So the facts are pretty damning all by themselves.
And I know states like Mississippi, which have reduced their solitary population. Mississippi went from 1,000 people to, I think, under 300. They've actually seen decreases in violence. Just to kind of further on that point. But yeah, no, I encourage anyone who's watching to check out Solitary Watch. They have a lot of great reporting. It's actually what got me involved in the issue of criminal justice in general. I wrote a paper where Solitary Watch was all of the sources. But yeah, sorry, a little digression. But yeah, I guess talking about advocacy, when you have this, there seems to be both a problem of awareness popularly in the country, and also like a more systemic problem in actually getting changes made. Do you think it's more important to kind of get a popular base that knows about solitary? Because it's hard to not, there's only one opinion to have about solitary once you learn the facts about it. It just seems like not that many people know the facts about solitary. So is it purely a matter of awareness, or is it more one where we have to focus on legislative, judicial means of changing it? Five, what do you think on that question?
Personally, both. So it's a constant fight because we're attacked on both angles, right? We're attacked with laws that allow the abuse to happen. We're attacked with laws that allow the people to be captured in its context. But then we're also, we don't take overall change methods like Gene was saying. Things have been incremental here in the States. So even if you take places like Dominican Republic, where they actually replaced the correctional staff with social workers, and in other states where they actually treat people human. But incarceration here has a long history that we don't talk about, a long history of race, a long history of, of oppression of a certain population of people. And literally that is seen through incarceration because nationally people of color make up the majority of people in incarceration, and literally the highest numbers as the punishment goes up. So as the punishment goes higher, the amount of people of color in those categories go higher. So when you talk about the death penalty and life without parole, and you talk about solitary confinement and torturous conditions, the people of color are mostly in those categories. Moving forward, I believe that advocacy is much as important as legislation. Unless we change the concept of the 13th Amendment, which literally says constitutionally that slavery is allowed, legislation techniques are just downsizing individual state models, right? So like Gene says, we have 50-something prison models. Literally, that's how we work. So we have to keep up the battle on that end, and at the same time help to provide services for people who are disenfranchised, right? Because incarceration just doesn't end with the suffering. When people get out of solitary, no matter how mentally deranged they are or disassociated from social networking skills or even human capabilities, there is no resources. As a matter of fact, there's more laws to make resources less. So I say that to say that we have to fight on all angles. And it's hard as an advocate because, we rally in the morning, we're in the office in the afternoon, we're at legislative meetings in the evening, but at night we have to literally be at the bus stops to help people get to the facility. At night we have to be in the communities where people are affected, and the work never ends. So yes, all angles we need to fight on because we're attacked on all angles.
I just want to emphasize that for Johnny and Five, the work never does end. I've never seen two guys who worked as hard as they do. But I think that there are 4 parts to where we see success in battling solitary confinement in New York City, for example, or in Illinois, where they managed to close TM Supermax prison. There have been 4 parts: legislation, a really strong grassroots movement, and support from the media. So when you have all those 4 things coming together, then you start to see change.
Sorry, I missed the first one. I think your mic went out. Can you just go through those again?
Yeah, it was. I said it was legislation, litigation, and legislation. Even when laws are introduced and they're not passed, that puts pressure on the state. So legislation, litigation, so lawsuits, grassroots activism, and support from the media. All 4 of those things.
I completely agree. Since I've been, publicly advocating for, against solitary since I've been home, one of the things that never ceases to surprise me is just how much people don't know. And, I've spoken in numerous panels, and afterwards people are like, really? And I'm talking about like when I testified at the Civil Rights Committee, like some of those people, they just didn't believe that some of the things that the conditions that I described were real. So that lack of awareness. I mean, just informing people, it kind of sets that I guess that strong foundation for the legislation and the advocacy and the media push. People just don't know, and the first step to change is, being aware that there is a problem. If you're not aware of the problem, then you can't change something you don't know. And it's just, it just the complete disconnect over what's actually happening and what they believe is to be happening. And part of this, G alluded to it earlier, or actually spoke to it earlier, as far as it's hard getting information from prisons. They just don't like to tell you what's going on behind their doors. It's like a world within a world. It's a microcosm of society, and they don't want you to know what's going on. And people have falsified numbers, for whatever the reason, but it's just difficult getting information. So that further distorts the problem and makes awareness even that much more difficult.
And building on what Johnny was saying, as a journalist, I also want to let people know that basically the First Amendment ends at the gates to the prison. The courts have found that journalists have no right to be able to go into prisons and tour the premises or interview people. That the First Amendment doesn't trump the safety and security, which is based on the word of prison administrator. So even reporting and getting that information out to the public is really, really challenging.
Although it does. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say that also when you speak about isolation, you have to understand that these people, and literally when we're in solitary, have no rights, right? So people seem to think, and one of the greatest questions I get is around tickets, and they're like, well, what was the outcome of the court case with the ticket? Because I tell them that you have to pay for a ticket, that on Rikers Island, tickets are $25 a charge, upstate in New York, $5 a charge. But not only that you're getting more of a sentence, right? Sometimes people get additional prison time. And you have encumbrances that happen because of maybe property damage or whatever they're accusing you of, but there's no court trial process for that. It is literally just a higher ranking officer who is judge, jury, and executioner. So one officer writes a ticket, and his coworker is literally the judge, jury, and executioner on your charges. So you have no rights. And when you go to court, beyond the charges that you're there for, because no one, is in isolation because of their charges, it's a different appearance toward the court, right? When you're coming in, you're shackled, you got like a mask over your face, you got gloves over your hands, you got chains around your waist, and they're hearing you on another charge, but it looks like you're problematic. The other thing is that when there's certain sentences and certain laws that differentiate in every state. So some states have split bids, some states have flat bids. When I mean bids, like sentences. So you can get 5 years, or in some states you can get a 2.5 to 5. So that means at 2.5 years you can make it to parole. If you're in solitary, you can forget about that. You're going to max out. So people don't have any legal rights when they're in isolation. And as a matter of fact, I believe that Gene and Solitary Watch has exposed a lot of stories where the majority of deaths, assaults, brutality, rape, sexual abuse, and even suicide happens within solitary. So this is the focal point of the prison, and nobody exempt from there. No matter how people are separated within the prison structure, everybody goes to solitary. Kids, pregnant women, doesn't make a difference.
Yeah, and in having these conversations about solitary, I was talking about it with Sarah Short, who I know works at Solitary Watch and was in solitary in Iran, and when she talks about solitary in the U.S., she kind of makes the same point, that solitary isn't just this punishment. It's actually something that is part of mass incarceration. It's something that's necessary to mass incarceration into the prison system, not just as a disciplinary, but as like intrinsic to the system itself. Is there any way of doing away with solitary without also tackling the issue of mass incarceration?
I doubt it. I think that that's the first step to addressing it. Literally, mass incarceration is what? We remove people from the community and place them, like Johnny said, inside this microcosmic world with different rules, right? And then we just repeat that concept, like Commissioner Marty Horn had said. Corrections just replicates what society does. So we take those persons and put them into a different dungeon-like state. And I think that addressing that is the first step to addressing mass incarceration. You must address those who are suffering in a dungeon-like state, and then also uplifting them to being looked at as humans, right? Because the dehumanization process is what allows this type of treatment to happen. That says that somehow you deserve this because you're incarcerated, or somehow because you've committed these acts. You know, people don't commit crimes, they commit acts. But certain communities get criminalized and certain acts get criminalized. So this certain population of people are demonized, and this allows the abuse to happen.
I agree with Five. I think a precursor to really sweeping change as opposed to incremental change is an end to the incredible dehumanization of people in prison that we have in this society, and that's not something that extends to most other developed countries. It's why we have a purely punitive model and not a rehabilitative model, and it's why we don't mind putting people in closets for 10 or 20 years at a time. So I think a change in the system of mass incarceration and a major change in consciousness.
Yeah, and now, Gene, since you frame the issue so explicitly as one of human rights, do you think there's any chance of kind of a more sweeping national movement on the issue in that framework? I mean, I know there have been congressional hearings on solitary recently within the last few years. Is there any thought of something that could more sweepingly do away with solitary as opposed to a gradual movement that we're seeing right now?
I wish that I could say yes, but I don't think we're anywhere close to that point yet. I don't even see movement within the Federal Bureau of Prisons. I mean, we do have a federal prison system, and they are actually the worst some of the worst practitioners of solitary confinement of any prison system in America. And certainly both the Department of Justice and the Congress have the power to change that situation, and I don't see any movement in that direction. In Congress, introduced by a gentleman from New Orleans, a congressman from New Orleans, that would merely study solitary confinement, to do a national study of solitary confinement, have a commission to find out exactly what is going on in our federal prisons, and that can't even make it out of committee. So we have a long, long way to go.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna try something here. We'll see how it goes, but I'm interested in hearing how you guys handle, and kind of also do this as a way of advising people who are looking to advocate against solitary, but how you handle a lot of the common questions that come up when you're talking about solitary, especially from people in the Department of Corrections or people who are skeptical. So I'll just do a couple of quick questions that I get a lot, and I think that people who are advocating and might not know as much about solitary would love to hear your takes on. So maybe we could start with the infamous, the worst of the worst question. So what do you do when people come to you and say, well, we need solitary for the people in prison that just can't be in the general population, the people who are killing other people in prison, the people who are just incorrigibly violent? Johnny, you want to start?
Yeah, I would say, and I actually don't get that question a lot, but I would say, because here's the thing, sometimes it's created a system where the cure is worse than the disease, and what I mean by that is that, for example, we take a look at the death penalty. We kill people to teach them not to kill people. Right, so and it's sort of like the same concept. So we place these people in this completely, sensory deprivation, inhumane kind of, the most inhumane kind of environment known to man, and then ask them to change their ways, ask them to behave better, or we're putting you here because of this. So if I put you in there because you're acting this way, then what does that make me? I think that compassion goes a long way. And even with separating people from the general population, it doesn't mean that you have to treat them in a less than in any way less than a humane, in any type of humane treatment.
Okay. Gene, kind of a variation on the same question. What do you do if you can't use solitary confinement? What do you do with that person who kills another person in prison, who kills a guard? Do you just transfer him to another prison? How do you handle that without solitary confinement?
Well, I think we can look at some models in Europe, and especially I like to look to the UK because it is a very multicultural society, and they actually have the highest incarceration rate in Europe, but they have 48 people in solitary confinement. Actually, they have 48 solitary confinement cells, and they're usually not all full. And even there, so when you say the worst of the worst, that's a tiny, tiny fraction of the people who are in solitary today. I mean, just a minute fraction. But second of all, I have a friend who's been working in this movement for 10 years who says, okay, so you can't have him in a cell with another guy, but how come he can't call his mother? I mean, there are just many, many ways of making separation, as Johnny described it, less than torture. And I do see other countries doing that, even with the small number of people that they're isolating. They're putting more programming in the cells, they're getting therapy, they're getting education, they're able to communicate by phone with their families. There are ways to make to be safe without torturing people.
Great. And 5, how about, so in 5 years, there's no solitary confinement at all. How do we get there? What is the process that we take from here to get to a United States without solitary as it looks like right now?
I'm sorry. You said in 5 years there's no solitary. How do we get there?
Yeah, I'm just saying if in the utopian world where we're able to use these advocacy efforts to get rid of solitary, how is it that they actually succeed? What are the steps that we take to systemically do this?
One, I'm glad you didn't ask me that first question because I've actually had Kobe used to stalk me on Twitter about that question. I have so many answers, they just unfriended me. So I think that we actually have to take the actual look at why do we isolate people, right? And I mean this because we have a model that has been working in other places, literally nationally, but also in New York as well, in the Clinton facility. We had a model that created residential humane units in some sense, so people who had problematic behavior. That's the real question. What do we do when people act out, right? Well, we already placed them in incarceration in society, so what do we do inside of that environment? I think it's a perfect time, isolation is a perfect time to get a person's underlying issue. And that 5 years from now, I look at us ending it, is because we actually have units that can separate those who are problematic and need therapy because of mood behaviors disorders. 57.7 people suffer from mental illness in America, and like Gene had said, nationally and especially in America, especially in New York, there's only one category of serious persistent mental illness which is excluded, which is a small amount of people, even though all the other variations. So it's like, why are we placing people in solitary? And until we start restricting it, it starts with recognizing that we do use solitary. 2, restricting certain people that are placed in solitary. So some people just shouldn't be there. Like Johnny said, if your brain isn't fully developed, you shouldn't be there. If you're pregnant, holding another person in your child in your stomach, you shouldn't be there. And then once we isolate those people, we'll drastically see that 2/3 of the people that is in solitary nationally probably aren't because of problematic behavior. It's literally because of drug abuse, right? That's the repercussion of it. Drug use. Also, mental illness, mood disorders, and also sometimes people are just there because they want to get out of the location that they're in, and they use that as a reason to get to another location. So I think that we will discover all these different reasons once we start restricting people from being in isolation. In 5 years, we can get there. We can get there now if we did that, in my opinion.
Great. And then we're running towards the end here, so just one last set of questions. And this one I'll ask each of you to respond to because I think it's an important one. If you're talking to someone who's viewed this webinar, been moved by what you've all said, and ask you, what do I do about this massive problem of solitary confinement? What do you tell them in like 1 minute? What's your elevator pitch for what the best thing they can do is? We'll go Johnny, Gene, and then 5.
I say you can start by writing your legislators. I say start by attending public hearings and voicing your concerns about solitary confinement. I'd say join grassroots movements like CAKE, Jails Action Coalition, Incarcerated Nation, and let your voice be heard and your distaste.
Great, Gene.
Yeah, well, of course, the first thing you should do is start reading Solitary Watch, sign up to get our posts, and follow us
Exactly.
on Twitter and Facebook. Then you'll become informed about the issue, and you will also be connected to grassroots movements in your state or locality or college and university or faith community. In addition to becoming involved in that way, I would say start writing letters to somebody in solitary. Have a visceral, one-on-one human experience that can tell you what it's like, and nothing else can, and can also bring immediate relief to another human being.
Yeah. 5?
Yes. Well, first I would say go to Solitary Watch, and you can get all the information. But then also, I have a website that's going to be coming up next week. It's incarceratednation.org. It'll have all the links nationally and statewide for all the movements against solitary. That's the underlying issue. But then also that there is so many things that you can do. Twitter, tweet, repost, start the conversation, just talking about it. And like Johnny said, those representatives who are in your legislature, that are in your community, what is their opinion that they're getting paid to speak on your behalf for? So in 1 minute, I would tell a person anything that you do involved is not ignoring it. So anything that you do is good.
All right, thank you. And I guess to give the student pitch, I would encourage people to join advocacy groups at their universities if they exist, and start them if they don't. Student Alliance for Prison Reform, which is the kind of umbrella group that's hosted this chat, is doing its best to bring people together, and we work a lot on solitary confinement. And yeah, as Gene said, I would also give a pitch for letter writing. We've started doing that here at Princeton, and it makes a world of difference. So we're running towards the end of the hour now. I'm sure you being people watching this at home, in your dorm rooms, wherever, have a lot of questions to follow up on, questions that I didn't ask. There's going to be a solitary chat after this on Twitter, I believe using the hashtag solitary chat. I don't know. Maybe someone can clarify. But you can just follow one of the 3 speakers we have today and ask them questions and see their responses. And you can get 5 to answer the worst of the worst question at great length, / 140 characters.
It's just the worst of the worst.
All right. Does anyone, do any of you 3 have any last comments to say? Anything glaring that we missed before we wrap up?
I just want to thank you and everyone at the Student Alliance and at SPEAR for having us here tonight. And it's so involved in this issue. It's just amazing. After all the years that the 3 of us have been working on it, to see the student movement really taking shape has been really inspiring.
Yes. If I have one thing to say, it would be say thank you. Thank you for being students for prison reform and education and reform, to be honest. All the change in society has been made by students since, we remember all the leaders, but we forget about all the students that have paved the way.
And also for involving the voice of the people directly affected. Like I mentioned before, we're often excluded from conversations, and not only for students but for people in general to have the courage to say no. The people, these people are the people that we want to speak to because they have the direct experience and they are closest to the problem. I think that's definitely a step in the right direction, and taking that participatory approach is definitely an approach that'll get you far. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think if this webinar has shown anything, it's that you guys are more eloquent and more articulate in talking about this issue than we can ever be, and we can only hope to assist in that effort. So we'll continue to try to do so. But thank you so much for joining us today, and I think with that note, we'll wrap up. Thank you again.
Nice. See you on Twitter.
Thanks, Daniel.
Yeah, let's go on Twitter. Turn to the tweets.